Hello, 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 and welcome to The Global in the Granite State, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Thank you so much for deciding to take a moment to listen into this critical conversation. We continue to appreciate everyone's interest in these insightful discussions and are amazed at the global community we have created. If this is your first time listening, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and your host for this program. As a leader of this community-supported nonprofit, I want to take a moment to thank all of our members, donors, and sponsors for their generous support. We cannot do this work without you, and we only do it because of you. If you are not yet a donor or a member, please do consider supporting this critical work in this way. You can find out more at wacnh.org. A special thank you to our series sponsor, McLean Middleton, for your ongoing generous support. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 100 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Now, on with the show. From the beginning of the American experiment, and for time immemorial really, governments, leaders, rebel groups, and pirates have been taking hostages and ransoming them for money, political considerations, prisoner swaps, and any number of other negotiated ideas. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire recently led a diplomacy simulation at a local high school which focused on the Barbary pirates' crisis of 1794, where the Dey of Algiers held 100 American sailors captive and successfully negotiated a ransom equal to 1/4 of the American annual budget at the time. While the students negotiated their own resolution to this conflict, it highlighted the issue of political hostages as an issue that still resonates today. With at least 46 Americans currently held by foreign governments, who the U.S. has identified as illegally detained, this is an issue that has hit close to home for many people. This does not even include the thousands of people held around the world by various rebel and terrorist groups, or held by their own governments for repressive reasons. So, what is the current state of hostage-taking by governments? How do we know when someone is a hostage accused of fake charges? And what can be done about it? Fortunately, the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, located right here in New Hampshire, is trying to answer many of these questions through their work.
I am the mother of 5 children. In 2012, our oldest son, James Wright Foley, was taken hostage by ISIS on Thanksgiving Day, 2012. And 2 years later, he was horrifically beheaded in a very public way by ISIS in 2014 in Syria. It was within 3 weeks, actually, of his murder that I felt very challenged as an American citizen that we could do better. I had trusted our government when they kept telling me Jim was a priority, and the reality was he was not. At that time, our government was not prioritizing the return of innocent Americans.
That is Diane Foley, president and founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. She is an amazing leader and advocate for the safe return of all Americans who are being held illegally around the world. As a leading voice in this space, there is no one better to talk about the state of hostage-taking today and how we can all remain safe traveling in the world.
Jim was a voracious reader. He initially taught in Teach for America for about 5 years. Got his first master's in creative writing because he loved reading and writing. He was passionate about issues and most especially a very good listener. He really wanted to understand people's stories, particularly people who were from a different country or had a different worldview. So eventually he found journalism. He graduated from Northwestern Medill School of Journalism in 2008 and embarked on a conflict journalist career. initially embedded with the armed forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. But then when the Arab Spring of 2011 started, he became a freelance conflict journalist, traveling to Libya and eventually to Syria. So he became very passionate about we Westerners understanding their yearning for freedom and really felt those stories mattered.
These stories do matter, and the work of conflict journalists is just as important as it is dangerous. Jim's capture by ISIS was not the first time he was illegally detained for his work as a journalist, having spent 44 days imprisoned by the Libyan government for his reporting on the civil war there in 2011. This did not deter his spirit or diminish his passion for bringing light to these important global stories, as he began making several trips into Syria to cover the civil war there. After Jim's death,
we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation in September of 2014, and Jim has challenged us to have the moral courage to try to make a difference, to work with our government, to make policies better, to prioritize the return of Americans, to also prevent hostage taking, and to promote journalist safety. It's really all based on Jim's challenge. He aspired to be a man of moral courage. So he challenged me and friends and strangers to start the Foley Foundation. So it's been 10 years. This is our 10th anniversary this year. And I'm wearing a Freedom Run shirt because every fall, actually on October 19th, we'll do our annual run walk 5K, actually in Rochester at the Rochester Foley Community Center. And everyone's invited. You can register a day of. It's a family event. We have kid run. And we also can do it virtually wherever you live because your caring, your donations to our work are just deeply appreciated. We need the help and support of good people in the community.
Of course, as we mentioned at the start, hostage taking is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has happened throughout the ages. From ancient Greeks to the Incas and various kings and queens of Europe, this tried and true practice has survived throughout the ages. However, most of these hostages were important leaders, not everyday citizens.
You are absolutely right, Tim. Hostage taking has a long history. Goes back into our country and certainly throughout the world. Often when a captor feels impotent, really doesn't know how to get leverage on another people, they'll take innocents and use them as political pawns.
Political responses have varied over the years to this tactic, and there have certainly been some lessons learned. However, because of the diversity of groups that have engaged in hostage-taking varies so widely, it is difficult to have a specific policy prescription that will fit all scenarios. However, it does seem that there is some research that indicates what doesn't work.
At that time, our country had chosen not to negotiate at all, particularly with terrorist groups. The feeling was that if we negotiate, that it'll incentivize captors to do more of this. However, what was interesting was that the evidence showed otherwise. The research at that time in 2012 from RAND Corporation was that if you do not find a humanitarian channel, some way to talk with captors, people who are taken hostage will be killed because they will have no value for captors. Sometimes people think that when we make deals with bad guys or whatever, people who take our people, that we're incentivizing. But our research shows that the taking of Americans has stayed level in spite of many trades and many negotiations. So we're doing research to continue because obviously we want to deter the practice of hostage taking.
The official policy of not negotiating with terrorists for the return of hostages was first outlined by Richard Nixon, after Palestinian militants took hostages at the Saudi embassy in Khartoum in 1973. Following President Nixon's maxim that there can be no negotiating with terrorists, the militants executed their captives. While the U.S. has worked around this policy of not negotiating in a number of ways over the years, it wasn't until 2015 that a serious review of policy took place and many changes were implemented at the federal level.
President Obama felt it was in the best interest of our country to not negotiate. So Jim and 3 other Americans held with him by ISIS were not negotiated for, and thus they were all killed and used for propaganda. So at that time, we had no one accountable in our government to bring them home, no one to help families. I was kind of sent in circles for the 18 months I tried to go to Washington and advocate on Jim's behalf. I was ignorant about our policy. I trusted when they told me Jim was the highest priority. So I really felt there was a need for a nonprofit to advocate for innocent Americans, be they journalists, diplomats, educators, aid workers, who go out into the world to do important work. Targeted because they're American, there needed to be some support from our government. So actually, within a year after Jim's, less than a year, by June of 2015, President Obama was really pushed to do something. So they did a hostage review, government and non-government review, interviewed victim families like ourselves and experts within government, and came up with a whole new structure in our government to address this issue. So we now have a 3-prong hostage enterprise, if you will, based in the State Department, FBI, and at the White House. So at least now there's some professional advocates. And since 2015, more than 130 innocent U.S. nationals have come home due to the effectiveness of the enterprise. So there's been a lot of progress, still a lot of challenges, however. The first attempt in 2015, when the hostage enterprise was first established, was focused primarily on hostages. And our government defines that as a person taken by a terrorist, pirate, or criminal group. So it's more of a criminal type capture, kidnapping, if you will, more in the FBI realm.
However, this actually did not deal with the practice of foreign governments taking U.S. citizens when they travel abroad and using them to extract various concessions. Many of these cases of governments illegally detaining U.S. citizens focus on prisoner swaps or trying to push a certain political agenda. One of the most fascinating cases came in 2018 when Canada arrested the daughter of Huawei's founder on fraud charges and held her on a U.S. extradition request. Of course, she was allowed to stay in her multi-million-dollar home, but that's another story. Almost immediately after she was arrested, China arrested 2 Canadian citizens on spying allegations. Over the course of the next 2 years, high-level negotiations were held, and the 3 people were eventually released back to their home nations. While this did not technically deal with a U.S. national, it is easy to see how illegal detentions can happen, and people can be caught up in geopolitical tensions just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Since there were so many high-profile cases of governments engaging in this practice, a revision of U.S. policy was needed.
In 2020, the Robert Levinson family worked with us to develop the Robert Levinson Hostage Taking and Accountability Act. That act gave 10 criteria for a wrongful detention designation for a U.S. national. That is a designation that occurs when another nation deliberately targets a U.S. national just because they're American, not because they've done anything wrong or illegal, but simply because they're a U.S. national. Like an example was Evan Gershkovich or Alsu Kamasheva, 2 journalists who are U.S. nationals and were working in Russia, in Alsu's case, visiting her elderly mother in Russia. But they were targeted because of their U.S. nationality, if you will. And so we have these 2 buckets, if you will, and now Consular Affairs, which is a department of the State Department, normally their job was just to keep track. If an American is arrested in prison in a country, they'll let the family know, periodically check in on them, but have never had a role of advocacy or decision-making in terms of maybe they're wrongfully detained. That has not been their role. But since Levinson, they have this huge challenge now to look at the thousands of Americans who are rightfully arrested around the world and tease out those who are in fact wrongfully targeted and arrested. And so it is a process which we are working with our government on. At times it's a very opaque process, and falls on the Secretary of State to actually make the decision of wrongful detention or not. But it's a big deal to families, because if their loved one is designated as a wrongful detainee, they get all the services of the special envoy for hostage affairs at State Department. If they're not, they do not. So for families, it's very difficult. So we work with a lot of the families in all parts of the process, but certainly for a lot of the families who are not getting as much advocacy, particularly.
While the Levinson Act has pushed the government to identify and advocate for wrongfully detained Americans abroad, there are still challenges to the efforts, as well as major impacts on the people and their families. One of these major issues actually starts when a detainee does finally return home.
Our work at the Foley Foundation revolves around doing research with victim families and returnees so we can see what still isn't working well. Some people come home financially devastated. They owe taxes, credit card bills. None of this stops while people are being held. Even if they're held years, they'll come home with lots of debt and financial issues, never mind psychosocial issues. So there are many areas that need to be explored, and we must work on deterrence.
It amazes me that even if someone is determined to have been wrongfully detained by a foreign government or taken hostage by a non-state actor, there is currently no way for them to keep their life together. People lose jobs, bills pile up, skills are lost, families torn apart, and sometimes lives are even cut short by the horrible treatment many of these people endure while being held. However, there is hope that relief may be on the way.
I think Levinson Act is continually being refined. This year, several things hopefully will make it into the National Defense Appropriations end of the year, such as families not having to pay taxes, victims when they come home, such as problems with credit card companies, that sort of thing. But I do think there's a lot of need for more work in the area of sanctions. And unfortunately, a lot of the countries responsible for the targeting of our citizens are already heavily sanctioned. So it's not easy to do the investigating to all other parties related. And in some cases, we haven't done enough in that regard.
Speaking of sanctions, the Levinson Act does allow the U.S. government to sanction people and foreign organizations or governments involved in the taking of U.S. nationals. 9 months after the signing of an executive order to allow for these types of sanctions to move forward, President Biden sanctioned people and entities in Russia and Iran for their role in the illegal detention of 6 Americans, 4 in Iran, 2 in Russia. However, the challenge remains that in many cases these sanctioned individuals are already being sanctioned by the U.S. government for other things that they've been involved with. So, sanctions are certainly part of the solution long term, but as we know in regards to previous conversations that we've had about sanctions, they work best when the world is united in implementing them. To that end, arbitrary and illegal detentions require global collaboration to stop future takings. The higher the global cost of taking anyone's citizens for political purposes, the less likely countries are to engage in it. This is the idea behind the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations, which 78 nations have already signed on to. Crafted in 2021 by the Canadian government, this builds on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which states that arbitrary detention is contrary to international law. However, that leaves the enforcement of this to individual states. While the initial report out of this act, which will outline recommendations on building deterrence, is still being crafted 3 years later, the fact that 40% of UN member states have signed on to this effort indicates a growing call for the end to this practice. Unsurprisingly, countries such as China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea have not signed on. In addition to these global efforts, the Foley Foundation has some recommendations on how the U.S. government can get a better handle on the situation, ease the burden on families, and improve the overall systems already in place.
Yes, every year we do an annual research report, as I said, with victims of kidnapping, be they families or returned hostages. and also with experts who work in this all the time. Like, for instance, at the moment, we have a special envoy for hostage affairs, Roger Carstens, who's actually was appointed in the Trump administration and has been very effective in helping us bring home more than 100 hostages. And the President Biden has been very, very effective. But one of our big recommendations that's been hard for us to get traction is we would like our government periodically to do a review of the entire enterprise with input from families and victims every 5 or 10 years, or at the minimum, because right now we find all kinds of issues. Like, one of the issues is certainly how one designates one of our citizens as, in fact, wrongfully detained. The fact that it's really opaque to families. Families have no idea what's holding it up, why their loved one isn't designated, etc. There's always work to do. And in this regard, there's a lot of gray area still. Many families yearning for that designation and support who are not yet getting it. And it's difficult because captors will manufacture all kinds of what they say is evidence against, and often trials are also very opaque in other countries. Those are the challenges that we face. But we've made progress. And so I feel evidence-based research needs to continue a lot more in the area of deterrence. How do we deter this? How, as Western nations, can we collectively work on deterring the use of innocent human beings for political leverage, if you will? Like in Gaza, I mean, look what happened with the hostages in Gaza. We had a report that came out in September of 23 that said terrorism had gone down, and then October 7th came. So truly, different parties continue to use people for their leverage.
How has the Foley Foundation come to understand this issue and build out a strong foundation for their work as they advocate at the federal level for improvements and responses? Well, of course, research plays a major role in this. Every year, the Foundation puts out a report to collate the most recent trends, gather relevant data, and discuss with experts in the field and families affected by this horrible practice.
5 years ago, we decided, how were we going to find out what's really happening? As I said, in 2015, this new hostage enterprise was set up in our government. But because a lot of work with families is totally confidential, how were we going to know if this was working? Was it really helping bring people home, or was it not? So one of the ways we felt we could do that was to begin an annual qualitative and quantitative research with people undergoing the ordeal. So that's when we started doing it. So the part with victims and hostage families tends to be more qualitative, more open-ended, like what has helped, what has not, what services do you need, what ways are your needs, have your needs not been met?
So, what does the most recent report tell us about the state of illegally detained people abroad?
The other part of our research is we keep track of a number of people that we feel are wrongfully detained or held hostage abroad. Our numbers tend to be higher than our government. First of all, our government's numbers are totally confidential. They don't share them with us or with anybody. They only let a family know if they hit the wrongfully detained category. But because we feel that a lot of times we look at the Levinson criteria to see what the story is. But at the moment, actually, now, when our findings came out in July, the number was 46. Now it's down to 42 because we had several people come home recently, as you know. The other stat is that now, in spite of what happened in Gaza, the horror of that hostage taking, 78% of US nationals who have been taken hostage are in fact held by other governments, like Russia, like Iran, like China. And many of them who have come home, more than 50% of those who have been released, involved a prisoner exchange. That has been rather controversial.
As we have discussed, prisoner swaps can be the goal for other countries when they grab a foreign national, as was the case with China in 2018. and as we have seen in many recent cases with Russia. Whether the US and its allies give up weapons dealers, assassins, hackers, or spies who were so deep undercover that their children didn't learn about their own Russian heritage until they landed back in Russia after the exchange, there are difficult decisions to be made. Some of the criticisms are valid, while others are designed to gain political points and attack whoever made the decision to make the swap.
Particularly with the Victor Boot being released for Brittany Griner. Those are difficult calls. But the reality is, as a nation, I think we have to have the moral courage to prioritize the return of our people. And that is what is hard. We must do that. And that has proved to be most effective with other captor groups. So the prisoner exchange, however, sometimes that has not been necessary. We've been able to find other ways. And that's where Ambassador Roger Carstens has been hugely effective in negotiating with other heads of state. These are tough decisions that any president is going to get criticized for, often by some who don't understand the complexity of it all. In spite of those difficult decisions, there's been a decrease of 42% in the number of US nationals actually in detention. So that is very hopeful to me. What concerns me these days is China. Some of our US nationals have been wrongfully detained in China an average of 12 and a half years. I mean, we're really talking about very little in that regard. However, again, a hopeful sign came when Pastor Lin was released not that long ago. This administration particularly has really prioritized the return of innocent US nationals. And a lot of our work is to hope that that continues, that we have the courage to make the tough decisions to bring our people home, while at the same time making sure that captors suffer consequences and being more creative in how, in fact, we do that.
Now, of course, we all know that these are more than just numbers and statistics. These are real people with real families and real lives. Therefore, it is important that we talk about some of the people who have been illegally detained, tell their stories, and put a human touch on this conversation.
There's so many stories. One of them is a missionary, Jeff Woodkey, out of California. He and his wife had committed their lives working in Mali and Niger, a good part of their life, getting free water for the people of the community, very beloved in Niger. But he was taken, a militant group came in related to ISIS and took him hostage, kidnapped him years ago. And that case was difficult to resolve. It was about 6.5 years. Jeff was tortured, held in chains, a very horrific situation. And we really had to intervene by talking to some of our partners. We have partners in various NGOs, former government people on our board, because that was supposed to be the essence of what the fusion cell was supposed to do, be able to negotiate. But one of the barriers is the fact that one of our policies is we will not pay ransom to a terrorist group. Understandably, nobody wants to fund terrorist groups. However, we have domestically funded the payment of ransom, which has in fact decreased kidnapping because we use the ransom as lure. So one of the areas of policy that I think needs some creativity is to allow our FBI to consider using, for example, ransom as a way to lure captors in so that they can be arrested and convicted, because the resolving of that case took much too long and Jeffrey suffered hugely. And I think we fumbled around because FBI couldn't use ransom as lure. So their hands were tied and made it difficult for them to negotiate effectively. So that's one example. Another is Alsu Kumasheva. We got fairly close with her. She's a young woman, Russian citizen, but also a US citizen who's worked for Radio Free Europe out of Prague for years, has 2 preteen daughters, and she traveled home to see her mom, who was ill in Russia. Within a month of her visit to Russia, she was targeted and jailed on various trumped up charges that she was doing journalism without a proper pass or whatever. And that was not easy. Because she was a dual citizen, it made it difficult too. Russia loves to consider prisoners like Alsu as their citizen, except in terms of targeting, they make sure they look for US citizens. But that was a very successful negotiation that President Biden led that involved Germany and several other countries. And I think that is the kind of collective model that as Western nations we need to look at, that we need to work with our partners to resolve some of these cases. You know, when Jim was held captive, he was held with about 20 other Western hostages. All of the European hostages came out. All were negotiated free, but the Americans and British were not, because we did not collaborate, because we did not work together. Whereas Alsu, Evan, and Vladimir Kara-Murza just were released because of that collaboration.
These are examples of everyday people who are doing good work abroad, visiting family, and just simply living their lives. Unfortunately, these are the kind of people who are caught up in geopolitical games and suffer the consequences. However, we don't want to leave people with the feeling that we should stop traveling, we should stop trying to do good in the world, or that anytime you leave the US, you are unsafe, because that is entirely not the case. There are parts of the world that you wouldn't need to worry about at all. Think countries that are friends and allies, unless there are some criminal or terrorist groups in the area. There are parts of the world which are very unsafe, but still benefit from US companies, NGOs, and government agencies at work. We recently held a conversation with a social entrepreneur who works extensively in low-income communities in Haiti. He travels to the country regularly and has built up relationships that help him safely navigate the country, although he did have to end his presence there at the height of the political instability. So, what do Americans need to do in order to stay safe and not put themselves in these positions?
That's an excellent question. One of the ways is to look at the Department of State website and sign up for the STEP program, particularly when you're going to countries when you don't know the country. Even if you do, though, I mean, a lot of Americans are dual citizens and things change. Now it's more dangerous to go to China and visit family or Iran. So it's important to go through the STEP program and just sign up so the embassy is aware of your need to travel. And when you look, they will give designations, so that they will give designations of areas where they strongly advise you not to travel, even if you have family there, because of the way it ebbs and flows, that often different nation states or terrorist groups are looking for people to target. So there's times when one should definitely not travel to a certain part of the world. So we have to be savvy about that, and not just have tunnel vision, but look at the big picture and be smart about protecting ourselves and our family. So that's one way. Another way, obviously, to know the language, anything you know about the culture, and to be respectful of the countries you go to keep a low, respectful profile, to not be rowdy and causing problems in country, because other people notice how we behave abroad. I think there's a lot in that regard also. But I think awareness is a big part. After Jim was killed, within a couple of years, one of Jim's best friends did a documentary called Jim, the James Foley Story. And that film, while sad in some points, helps people understand why journalists are in conflict zones, but also the horror of being targeted when you're just doing your work abroad, that is a reality for some people, not to be afraid of, but to be aware of and cautious before one considers traveling abroad.
Of course, the more you know about a place that you are traveling to, the better you can protect yourself. The more you engage in local customs and traditions, the better experience you will have. We all bear the responsibility to protect ourselves, while also working to protect others and move the ball forward on ending this dangerous practice. Thank you to Diane Foley and her team for the amazing work they do in this space and for giving her time for this great discussion. And thank you to you for taking the time to engage in this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and took some positive insights from it. If you did enjoy it, like the episode, subscribe, and join our global community by signing up for our weekly email newsletter on our website. Hope to have you join us for future conversations. This has been The Global and the Granite State, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Tim Horgan is the producer, director, audio engineer, editor, fact-checker, researcher, and alpha and omega of this podcast. Our theme music is Admin by A. Alto, and our interlude music is Separation by William King. Looking forward to next month's episode.